Thank you so much for joining us today. I pray that our time together will help you experience Jesus and to share His grace. Today we're continuing our series on faith. We're looking at the book of Genesis, specifically at the life of Abraham. And today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 20 and chapter 21. During this series, we've seen how God found Abraham, a man without faith, and that God continued to show His good character, His faithfulness, His loving kindness to this man. And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so Abram has continued to be formed in the image of God, and he grows in faithfulness. What we see in Genesis 20 and 21 is we see the great blunder. We see that Abraham he messes up. We see that God, despite this great blunder, that God provides the blessing. And finally, we see the great banishment. So we're going to look at these three things this week as we dive into Genesis 20 and 21. But before we start in our scripture reading, I want to tell you a story. When I was in junior high, sometime after school, we were hanging out around the building there at the junior high, and we were just kind of goofing off, being silly. And me and my buddies, we really liked martial arts movies, and so what we were doing is we were reenacting some of our favorite martial art kicks and high jumps. Now, I would have to say that none of us were quite athletic. In fact, we were the opposite. We were very unathletic, and we had not had any martial arts training, but we thought we were cool, and so we were just goofing off, being silly. When all of a sudden this group of girls decides to come and hang out around the edges of our boy group. And in that group happened to be this particular girl that I kind of had a thing for, had a crush on her. And so there was added pressure for me because I had to show off my buddies, show up my buddies, do better than them. And kick higher and punch stronger, and to demonstrate my knowledge of martial arts. And I remember that this girl was really sad, and I felt, man, if only I could just prove to her how great a martial artist I am, maybe that will cheer her up and impress her. Well, let me tell you what happened. As I'm preparing myself for this really big high kick, I lose my footing. And I fall flat on the ground. And wouldn't you know, just at the moment as my feet sweep out from under me, she happens to turn and look, and she sees me airborne on the way down to the ground. I hurt my backside and my pride as I heard the laughter erupt in the group of girls next to my friends. She was laughing so hard at my fall that tears were coming down her eyes. And I remember her coming over and going, "Are you okay?" "Well, I'm fine." Of course, I'm trying to kind of brush it off like, "Oh yeah, I meant to do that." And she said, "Thank you so much, because I really needed a laugh today." That was not the effect that I was going for. I was looking for shock and awe. And what I came up with was shockingly awful. I will forever remember that moment because it was such a blunder. I totally messed up. I had the intentions to do great things, but my body refused to cooperate, and gravity took hold. And I had a great blunder. Have you ever experienced something in your life? Maybe it wasn't just a fall, but a moment where you absolutely just failed miserably. And to call it a blunder maybe was an understatement. You just really messed up. If that's you, I want to let you know that you are not alone. The Bible is full of people who've totally messed up. David was a great example. He was a man after God's own heart, but there's some times he really just totally failed. I mean, Abraham. Here we see in Genesis chapter 20 that Abraham falls to an old sin. He surrenders himself to fear. And he makes this huge blunder. Let's look at Genesis chapter 20, and we'll start in verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the region of the Negev and settled near Kadesh and Shur. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said to his wife Sarah, "She's my sister." And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream at night and said to him, "You are about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman." What we see here in this snapshot, we see this great man named Abraham. He's moving to a new area. It's very probable that the whole area has been affected by the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and so he's going kind of away from that area. And so him and his flocks and his men and his multitudes and his millions of dollars and camels and all the great supplies that he has, move on into this area where he was afraid. This is not the same Abram who was in Egypt against a great empire and had nothing. This is a man of power and prestige with his own private army. God has proven himself over and over again. And yet, when fear snuck in into Abraham's heart, he did the same old habits that he had done so many years ago. Isn't it interesting that when fear is re-engaged in your life, that you're no longer confident? You become self-conscious. You start to wonder, well, maybe I'm not as successful as I once was. Maybe this fact that when Abram left, maybe when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, he felt that he was a failure because he tried to intercede on their behalf. Maybe he felt that his efforts were a failure. Maybe he's concerned about Lot. Maybe he doesn't know that Lot has been spared in the destruction on Sodom. Whatever it is, we see that his self-confidence, that confident mediator that he was just a chapter or so before, is fallen. He's crestfallen. And he's fearful. And so these old habits of telling everybody that his wife is his sister resurfaces. The same plan that they had when they were going into Egypt, they do the same exact thing. And isn't it interesting that they haven't learned from the last time that problem hit? Now, what you see here, I think, is just overwhelmingly, Abraham goes into this area, has power, money, prestige, and he goes into this area afraid. And so the king says, "Oh, this new guy's got a wife. Well, let's just add her to our harem." And I'm not sure if he wanted to form a political alliance with this powerful person, or if Sarah still at 90, turning heads. Jewish legend says that she was as beautiful as Eve. Now, I don't know if that's the case, but what you have is this 90-year-old woman becoming a wife of this king Abimelech. And yet, in this moment, God steps in and says, "I can't have this happening again." And so God steps in on behalf of Abraham and Sarah. And he actually appears to Abimelech in a dream and says, "Abimelech, you're a dead man. That'll wake you up." God tells Abimelech that Sarah was actually Abraham's wife and that he closed up the wombs of Abimelech's kingdom and nation. And Abimelech is like, "Dude, I didn't know. I thought, he said himself, she's my sister, and so I thought everything was okay." And God said, "I know that you've acted with integrity." And I want you to let that sink in for a minute. Abraham was afraid to go into this area because he said they knew not God. He did not think they were people of integrity. And here you see this king demonstrating more integrity and faith than Abraham is. Again, just like when Pharaoh proved to be a man more integrity than Abraham, this king, Abimelech, proves himself to be a person of integrity. And so he says, "Well, what am I supposed to do, God?" And God says, "Go give her back to Abraham. and ask Abraham to pray for you, and you will be forgiven. I love this fact that Abimelech argues with God and says, I didn't know this. If I'd known, I wouldn't have done it. And God says, I know. And notice the words that Abimelech uses. It says, would you punish a righteous nation? And yet God says, I knew that you were a man of integrity, Abimelech. And so I kept you from sinning greater. I protected my promise to Abraham. Now all you have to do is go send Sarah back to Abraham and have Abraham pray for you. And I'll have to admit, that would be a hard pill to swallow, is the man who lied to you, the one who deceived you, that you have to go and ask him to pray for you. What a humbling experience that Abimelech had to undergo. Yet he was willing to do that for himself, to save himself and his people. And so God spares the nation that is innocent. So what we see here in this story is we see the action of God, that God making a way of forgiveness. God making a way for forgiveness for Abraham. God making a way of forgiveness for Abimelech. And God standing up for Sarah and the promise that an heir would come through her. You see, God is protecting Sarah even when her husband wouldn't. And that's the end of episode 1, The Great Blunder. What we see at the beginning of Genesis 21 is the great blessing. What we see, let's read the first few verses of Genesis 21. It says, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. At the time of which God had spoken to him, Abraham gave him the name Isaac to his son whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son on Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. And now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. That's it. The long-awaited son of Abraham and Sarah, the son of promise. And there is only 7 verses dedicated to Isaac's birth. Isaac's, whose name means laughter. There's more discussion in those 7 verses about how hilarious it is that Abraham and Sarah, an older couple, would have a child. It's more of a joke than it is a birth announcement. This celebration is just so muted in compared to all this waiting and these promises that have built up for chapters and chapters. The years that have passed, waiting for Isaac to be born, and only 7 verses are mentioned about the birth of Isaac. I think that's funny. That sometimes we get so focused on our problems that we don't focus on the blessings that God has given us. So it's amazing what we see here, that God keeps his promises. Despite all of the time that has passed, despite all the difficulty that has happened between Abraham and Sarah, what we see that God has been faithful. Just as God had provided a way of forgiveness in this first chapter today, we see the second chapter that God has proven himself faithful to his promises yet again. And so we see the blessing of Isaac given to Abraham and Sarah. And you know their hearts were aflutter. I remember when my children were born. I remember those moments where the smile was just so ear to ear. I just was so happy to welcome the children that I had waited for. I can just imagine the smile on Abraham's face as he's holding Isaac, newborn, in his arms. A proud father living up to his name. What we see here now is the blessing somehow takes an ugly turn. That isn't it interesting how when God gives us blessings, sometimes that we take them for granted, or we become jealous, or we struggle with these blessings and they actually become curses. So what we see here in Genesis 21 verses 8 through 21 is what we call the banishment. We've seen how God has worked even in Abraham's blunder, and we've seen how God provided the blessing of Isaac, and now we see the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael. I want you to look at this in Genesis 21 verse 8. The child grew, this is Isaac, and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, a great celebration. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." And the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. What we see at this family celebration is Sarah coming up to Abraham, and she's seeing Ishmael playing with Isaac. This is a celebration of brothers. And yet, what she sees is not a happy laughter. She sees a threat. She sees frustration. She sees family problems. And so she, on this day of this great celebration, goes to Abraham, a man who is known for his hospitality, proven it over and over again, says, "This is what I want you to do. I want you to kick out Hagar and Ishmael." And Abraham is burdened. He is burdened because that's his son. That's his son, his flesh, that his wife is asking him to banish, to kick out of the house. And he's probably about 13 at this time, starting to become a man, and Abraham is looking forward to teaching him the ways of being a man, and yet he now is going to kick out his son out of his house. And so Abraham goes, and he doesn't know really what to do, but God says, "Abraham, it's okay. I will take care of Ishmael. I will take care of Hagar. You go ahead and you let them go." And so Abraham gets some things together, some food and some water, and he goes and he talks to Hagar, and he sends them away. And so Hagar says, "This looks familiar. I've gone down this road before." And they're in the wilderness, and the water runs out, and Hagar has lost all hope. She lays Isaac down. They must have traveled for such a long distance. Lays Isaac down, and she goes a far way, about a bow shot away, and says, "I cannot watch him die." And then an angel of the Lord comes to her, just like the last time she was in the wilderness, and says, "Why are you afraid? Do not be afraid, for God has heard your voice and the voice of your son." And what the verse in verse 18 says, "Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a great well of water. What you see is God coming to this woman saying, "I see you, I hear you, I see you, I hear you." And what you see is that the flashback to the last time when she had this encounter with God, and she said, "This is the God who sees," and Ishmael is named the God who hears. And God reveals his character again to the oppressed woman and her son in the wilderness. God provides water in a dry land. God gives his children water in the wilderness. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's a part of the story of God with children in the Exodus, that God provided water for them to drink. And God continued to bless Hagar and and Ishmael. And he became a great nation. That you see that even when people abandon us, when people let us go, and when struggles and relationships are broken, we can always know that God hears our cries, and God sees our situations, and he will not abandon us. What we see in these 3 episodes of Genesis 20 and 21 are that people screw up. People make bad decisions. But we learn 3 things about God that I want you to think about today. I want you to recognize that God always makes a way for forgiveness. Through the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, He has provided a way of forgiveness for you and for me, even forgiveness from our stupid decisions. God can deliver us. We see that God keeps His promises. That God says, I love you, I want to bless you, and that God is always faithful. He won't forget us. He won't forget His promises. He won't forget what He has done for us. For God so loved the world that He sent His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. That is a promise that He will not forget, that He will continue to be faithful. And finally, we see that God provides the way to salvation. Just as God shows Hagar the water in the wilderness, Jesus says the words, I am the living water. Whomever comes after me will never thirst again. You see, through Jesus, God provides salvation. Even in the darkest of times, even in the most greatest of struggles, Jesus will always be there, giving us rest and respite and salvation when we put our trust in Him. I pray that our time together has helped you experience Jesus and to share His grace. Be blessed.